When I was 15, I had to confront my caste for the first time. Up to that point, I had been told that I belonged to some other backward castes, but it never made any difference in my life. There were two Indias: the bad, backward India where caste still mattered, and the good, modern India, the one where I belonged. At 15, I had to announce my caste to the school authorities because it was required for some form of class 10 board exams. In a class of 50 students, I was one of the two people who belonged to these other backward castes. The other being my friend who was also the school topper. The common narrative went that there was this bad thing called the caste system during British and pre-British times. Then some social activists had cured India of its caste system, and now caste was just a thing in villages. One of the most prominent activists was Dr. Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar. The constitution in hand, blue suit, red tie, round specs, the finger always pointing towards something, he had written affirmative action in the form of reservations within our constitution, and that had cured India of its caste, and now political parties were just milking the caste system and reservations for political power. Do cities still have caste inequality? Hindus are divided into several groups of people. Some of these groups are arbitrarily superior to the others, according to ancient scriptures that dictate our lives. Our constitution recognizes the scheduled tribes and the scheduled castes, who were historically the most oppressed. The other backward classes, some of whom were very oppressed, while others are just kind of along for the ride now. And the upper castes, who were historically the oppressors. If you belong to a historically disadvantaged community, the constitution helps you get on a level playing field while applying for a job or a college through various affirmative action programs. Affirmative action programs, reservations, are often misinterpreted as schemes to help eradicate poverty. The actual idea is that if enough people from downtrodden communities are able to reach high places in society, they will be able to represent the needs of their own communities. Representation will prevent policies from being too favorable towards traditionally dominant groups of people. I remember the intense shame and guilt that this announcement brought to me. Here I was in a class of 50 people, some of whom were poorer than I was, announcing that I will get some special treatment just because I have a different surname. None of this was rooted in reality, by the way. Nobody had treated me differently, nobody said anything about it. A few very close friends made a few jokes about it, but it was all in good faith. Yet, the guilt remained. I imagine that my friend, the school topper, also faced the same guilt, but I can't say for sure. Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar was born into a Mahar family in Maharashtra. The Mahars being Dalits, which means that they were untouchables and couldn't really rise much in society. The highest that anyone from his community could aspire to was the post of a junior officer in the British Army in India. And his father was a junior officer in the army. Of course, Ambedkar was very bright as a student, so everyone expected him to follow in his father's footsteps, probably. But that didn't really happen, did it? In addition to being very smart, he was also an outcast. When he went to school, he would have to sit outside the class in one of these bags while everyone else sat inside and studied. This man would go on to frame the entire constitution for this budding republic, but when he wanted to drink water in his school, he could not just go and drink it by himself. He had to ask a peon to fill his water bottle. And if the peon was ever absent, the peon being upper caste, of course, if the peon was ever absent, he would have to either go home or spend the entire day without a drop of water. As we already established, of course, had Ambedkar touched the water himself, it would have made the entire water impure. It would have been a sin for his teachers to drink from it. It would have been a social crime for Ambedkar to have done it. The nation is seeing a rise in rhetoric against reservation. The rhetoric goes that political parties keep these affirmative action programs running just to win the favor of its beneficiaries and effectively buy their votes. Rhetoric against reservation can very quickly devolve into rhetoric against those who benefit from reservation. I am almost exactly the person that this anti-reservation rhetoric is aimed at. I belong to the Sonar community. The Sona stands for gold, so we were goldsmiths for feudal landlords and priests. And although we were poor, we never were downtrodden because we were always operating out of small shops and no landlord would punch the jeweler in the face. My grandfather pulled himself out of generational poverty by moving out of his village and into a nearby suburb where he was a Hindi professor. He didn't continue in the traditional task of being a goldsmith, and that turned out pretty well for him. He wrote poetry, he watered his plants, and he was loved by his neighbors, almost all of whom were also Sonars. Further, my father moved out of that suburb to Mumbai for work and then returned to a tier 2 city to build a stable coaching business. So naturally, I am in a position of privilege as compared to others within the caste. And then the entire caste is in a position of privilege compared to others within other backward castes. And then other backward castes are in a position of privilege as compared to scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. I am an extreme minority, statistically. But anti-reservation rhetoric can make me seem like the norm. It can also conveniently ignore the rest of the country collapsing under the weight of casteism. It can conveniently do that, and it does. I know Dalits. When I was growing up, our friend group consisted of 3 boys and 1 Dalit. And let me just say, I was always envious of him. My dad, he was just a movie producer, whereas his dad, he was a railway officer. My dad only received our Burley bungalow from his father, and everything else was his own sweat, his own blood, his own tears. You know, my dad had to go to Delhi thrice by train, and it was all for nothing. None of it ever worked out. You know, there was a moment in his life when he had to go 3 weeks cooking his own food. That is how broke he was. Eventually, he met his uncle, who also happened to be a movie producer. He had to slave under this random man for 1 year before he could even start his own production company. Trickle down films. I'm so proud of my dad. You know how much hard work goes into building a company? These Dalits want us to take all of the risks of entrepreneurship and risk our own capital while they just laze around in their government jobs. I know them very well. My good father struggled so much to build his empire just because there was no reservation for our surname. And before we go ahead, let me just tell you, if you go against me, you are going against what our great Swami Vivekananda said. The only safety, I tell you men who belong to the lower castes, the only way to raise your condition is to study Sanskrit. And this fighting and writing and frothing against the higher caste, it's all in vain. Do you think you know more than Swami Vivekananda? Ambedkar eventually managed to move out of his village, and his studies took him to Columbia, where he got a scholarship to study. And of course, this scholarship further then took him to the London School of Economics. Armed with the best knowledge that the world had to offer, and having faced the worst social conditions that the world had to offer, Ambedkar was uniquely suited to lead this young nation. And he did. He returned and he started actively fighting against the caste system at absolute grassroots levels. He did it as an activist, he did it as a lawyer. He fought for reservation and for the upliftment of the downtrodden castes at every level possible. This ended up accumulating a lot of political influence for him. And this influence eventually led him to head the committee that drafted our constitution. Prior to this, Ambedkar had been fighting very hard for reservation at every step possible. And now, in this position of influence, he could write it into the very core of this new nation. And this is where Ambedkar becomes a polarizing figure. Affirmative action, reservation, is hotly debated, not just in India but all over the world. The idea is that in the past, if one group of people benefited off of the exploitation of another group, for example, the whites and the blacks in America, if that was the case, then this exploited group should receive some special help from the government to bring them to equal footing with the oppressors. And this is not always in the form of money, because you can have money and still be socially excluded. This is in the form of representation. Unlike what we are often led to believe, India is not the only nation struggling with this concept of affirmative action. African Americans had a less than decent past in America. So, should a community that was slaves for 100 years and then still face some forms of segregation, should that community be provided some help from the government so that they do not end up being oppressed forever? Of course, it's a topic of debate. Those who agree with affirmative action contest that since African households were either slaves or segregated for most of American history, they of course did not have an equal access to opportunity, and generational wealth and generational connections must have accrued for white people that they still benefit from. And of course, if you're white, you probably do not face a lot of discrimination, and that probably helps you thrive in your work environment. Those who are against affirmative action believe that affirmative action helps those who are oppressed the least, young educated black people, at the expense of those who never oppressed them, young white people. And of course, the clear rebuttal to this is, no matter if a young educated black person is coming from a rich family, they will still face some forms of social discrimination in society. And the white person will not face those same social discriminations, regardless of their socioeconomic background. That's it. That's the same bullshit that we have been debating for the past 40 years, and we still are. Do you know how the Dalit's dad joined the railway? He simply abused the reservation system. Maybe if his surname was replaced with my dad's surname, maybe then my dad wouldn't have faced all of this trauma. Maybe then our family would have been happy. I don't think there was ever a moment in my life when my family was as happy as the Dalits. And it's all because of reservation. Do you know how I got to this position? I was never handed out anything. I never took any help from anyone. I'm a self-made man. It's through my own sweat, my own blood, my own tears that I'm sitting right now in front of you and have the privilege of talking to you. I was never given any reservation. Even my dad was opposed to this decision. He wanted me to take over as CEO of Trickle Down, but I said no. I don't want to be some whiny rich kid who's just doing what his dad gave him to. I made my own name. Do you know how much of my life I've spent depressed, just knowing that since my dad is slightly wealthy, anything I do will always be considered second rate, easy. I'm proud of myself now. And one day my dad will be proud of me too. One day he'll look at me without any disgust, without any hatred. He'll look in my eyes and tell me how proud he is of me. By the time I had to confront my caste, I was extremely aware that I had Brahmin friends who were not making as much money. I was extremely aware that I was opposed to the system of reservations, and I was extremely aware that all of this opposition was just rooted in self-hatred. But the self-loathing was too strong to allow for any sort of rationality to occur. I knew that nobody in my family had made use of reservations, and I felt very proud of it. All of these other OBCs were gaming the system to their advantage, but not me. Casteism was thinly concealed, and we had fooled ourselves into believing that cities had moved beyond the caste system. No matter how incompetent an unreserved student was, all of the problems in their lives were just caused by Ambedkar. And I believed them too. The plight of millennia of exploitation and social exclusion was similar to, even less than, the plight of some random guy who couldn't get into a medical college. Before we go any further, we need to acknowledge that caste-based reservations are not perfect. And anyone who claims so is being intellectually dishonest, or probably, doing it for votes. Since you need a certain degree of education before you can even use most affirmative action programs, the most downtrodden members of society actually do never get to use these. Since having a last name that was historically oppressed is very beneficial, caste identities are somehow incentivized through this system. And since the government is not bringing in enough high quality college seats and high quality job offerings, people who belong to the middle class but hail from an upper caste actually do have very valid reasons to get frustrated. Their frustrations are often misdirected at reservations or against lower caste people, but their frustrations are very, very valid. What's more imperfect than caste-based reservations, however, are the caste-based discriminations that have been going on for thousands of years. It's the trauma that societies have faced, and trauma is the right word to use here because systemic violence is essentially an inherent part of the caste system. We have this picture in our head of how violence occurs. It's always this bad man beating up another poor, downtrodden person using probably this whip. But that is very labor intensive. That's very inefficient violence, and whoever does this is probably just starting out in the career. A more efficient way of doing it is social exclusion. You don't have to put in the time and the money and the manpower into beating someone up if they never get to see you throughout their entire lives. And that is how the caste system violently excluded the lower castes. Religiously sanctioned ghettos formed all over in India in the form of villages and maybe some urban centers. And even today, if you go to any village in India, you'll see dominant castes there. And almost all of the houses will belong to people from the same castes. Even in cities today, people belonging to the same caste are more likely to live together than people belonging to the same socio-economic class. And this is genius, especially during feudal times. Think of it. You have this entire caste of people, all of whom can only do one thing, and you just push them out of the urban center, push them into a village where they only see people from their own castes who know the same jobs, who have the same opinions, effectively segregate them from the rest of society, the rest of civil urban society, and then they fight amongst themselves for the limited opportunities that present themselves. Had they been in urban centers, they might have found other opportunities, they might have discovered some other talents. Eklavya did discover his talent for shooting, didn't he? But, earlier on, I told you how Ambedkar's entire community aspired to be junior officers in the British Indian Army because that was the highest they could go. And that's still very privileged. You have the Dome community in Banaras that has been locked into this intergenerational task of burning the dead bodies of Hindus. It's very hazardous work. It's very terrible pay. And most people don't even want to do it because burning dead bodies is not exactly a shining career option. But they are generationally locked into it. And they can't leave. Who else will burn the dead bodies? You have Delta Meghwal, a 17-year-old bright student who was raped and killed by her PED teacher, left to rot in a water tank, and then carried away by the police in a garbage vehicle. Probably very, very close to your home right now, there is a manual scavenger diving into a sewer without probably even wearing a mask. The scavenger is of course Dalit, and he did not sign up for it. Nobody dreams of doing this when he is a child. This manual scavenger will take out dead twigs. He will take out carcasses of small animals that are blocking the drain. He will take out pieces of literal human shit with his bare hands just so that everything can keep on flowing normally. Do cities still have caste inequality? How many Ambedkars are cleaning your sewers? How many Ambedkars are lying dead in water tanks, raped by their teachers? And how many Ambedkars are out there burning your dead bodies? All of you are politically aware, right? You must have seen how those poor white people were harassed in their own country, inside their own homes. Just because some overworked, stressed out policeman decided to do something that was not politically correct. My family in Washington couldn't sleep for 2 days. It was horror. Did you see the Black Lives Matter protests? And now some college students were trying to bring in Dalit Lives Matter to India. Yeah, honey, we know Dalit lives matter. The question is, when will Brahmin lives matter? When will Thakur lives matter? I know we're trying to import all of this wokeness from America and Britain that's causing this great Western civilization to fall, but let me just point to some facts here. Let me just say what is on everyone's mind, but nobody is daring to say it out loud. If the caste system has survived for all of this time, for thousands of years, I propose that it has done so because it is important, because it has helped our great nation. Manu was a great man. In many ways, he reminds me of my father, and I just know that my father and Manu could never be wrong. So let me just say it out loud. Brahmins are genetically better suited for intellectual pursuits. Now, I know all of you leftists are just triggered and all of you scared centrists are just foaming at the mouths, but let me just show you some data that will just prove my point, alright? Let me just pull up some data. All of you leftists and all of you jihadis, all of you are from JNU, right? So let me just show you some data from JNU. First of all, named after a Kashmiri Pandit. But, alright. The Chancellor of JNU, Savarn. The Dean of Students, Savarn. The Director of Admissions, Savarn. In fact, you'll have a hard time finding any Dalit here. Any OBC even. And the same is true for all universities across India. Do you think that is just a coincidence? Apart from JNU, I also know that you vile leftists are being paid by News Laundry to spread all of your propaganda. Well, your propaganda laundry slipped up and they released this stupid report that called them out. They released a report of all the journalists in India and you'll be hard pressed to find any journalist who is not an upper caste. Do you think that's just a coincidence? Or are we just smarter? These Dalits want to take our position when they just do not have the minds for it. Do not let your feelings drive your decisions. Look at the facts. Look at statistics. And while we are on the topic of facts, let me just clarify that Ambedkar lied about everything in the Manusmriti. The Manusmriti says nothing wrong about caste, and in fact, the first M in Manusmriti stands for Marx. While doing my own research, I couldn't find any good specific source from where the caste system suddenly blossomed out. Ambedkar certainly believed that it was not Manu because it could not have been one person who brought this giant systemic change on an entire nation. And back then we even had larger areas under us. Ambedkar also believed that it could not have been Brahmins because we give them more credit for being smart than is due. So Ambedkar did not really provide any answer for a singular source, and I don't think anyone does. I'm pretty sure academic scholars of Hindu scriptures, scholars who can read, not YouTubers, scholars will have great points to give on this, but I just don't know. And my point is, how does it matter where it comes from? When the fact remains that there was once an oppressor class and there was once an oppressed class, and the oppressor class happened to be Brahmins. It could have been Egyptian cat mummies that told them to oppress Dalits. They still oppressed Dalits. And historically, there was an oppressed class which now deserves some form of affirmative action to take care of them. Why would anyone bring it up in this debate? I almost think that it's an attempt to divert attention from very serious systemic issues and bring in divisions between people who would usually stand together. But I don't believe that any YouTube channel that believes in rationality and believes in clear reason would do that, would they? I don't know. I don't have any reason to blame them. Yeah, whatever. Caste based reservations are everywhere. There are no places left in India where merit can thrive on itself. Look at this bun. And let's just assume that this bun represents all of the salaried positions in India. So these would be government employees, private employees, but this would not be farmers, farm owners, casual laborers who are mostly Dalits. This will just be private and government salaried positions. And the last we checked, there were 856 lakhs of these. 70% of these are in the private sector where there is no reservation. So there goes 70% of the bun. And then in this remaining 30%, not true to scale of course, in this remaining 30%, 40% of government jobs are temporary, where again there is no reservation. So there goes 40% of whatever this 30% had. And this is it. 18% of total. This tiny slice is all that we are fighting for. It almost shows you that these people do not care about merit at all. It's almost as if these people just want to hold on to vague notions of power that were fed to them at birth. I don't know. It's just a hunch. But maybe reservations in these 18% do not harm the upper caste as much as you would like to believe and are actually beneficial for the lower castes at not your expense. But what about NEET? Do you want some Dalit to operate on you? So we have data on this from NEET 2020 that was supplied by NTA, the national testing agency that conducts NEET across the nation. And we can have a look at data from NEET 2020 to check this claim. Alright, let me just pull up some data here. These are the number of people who qualified NEET in 2020 who belonged to unreserved categories, which were upper castes. These were the number of people who applied and belonged to the upper caste. So if you look at it, roughly 55% of people cleared NEET who were from unreserved categories and then got in. We also have data from scheduled castes here. So these many people got in NEET 2020 who used their SC reservations and these many applied. 51% of the people who used their scheduled caste certificate actually got into NEET. And you might see that 55 is slightly larger than 51, but that's not the point. The point is that the rate of selection is almost the same. And the larger point is that 190,000 people applied to NEET using their scheduled caste certificates. And 221,000 unreserved people got into NEET. So, do you see the extreme discrepancy in the number of people applying, even though we don't have that big of a difference in the number of upper caste people and the number of scheduled caste people? Why is this difference arising? What's the reason for it? Maybe it is because scheduled caste people are not subjected to the same sort of educational opportunities that upper caste people get, and maybe it is what's keeping them down, and maybe giving them representation here would not actually harm upper caste people but uplift the lowest rungs of society as a whole, you can also look at data for other backward classes and realize that reservation is imperfect. First of all, there are a lot of people who can claim to be OBC, and 6 lakh people applied to NEET using their OBC certificates. 3,60,000 got in, and although there will have been people in there who were genuinely downtrodden and who were genuinely held by their OBC certificates, you can't really say that all of them were held. You have several OBCs who did not maybe need it, but who still used it. So, of course, not perfect, but look at how many SCs can just reach a position where they can just apply to NEET. And this is what reservations are tackling. It's not a poverty upliftment program, it's a representation program. There's also the popular Dalit with a BMW case where people claim that only Dalits who are very rich, whose fathers own BMW and whose mothers are the presidents of India, even they use reservations unfairly, and in fact they are the only beneficiaries of reservations. But that isn't statistically the truth. The truth is that people from Dalit backgrounds, coming from the same socio-economic backgrounds, are 15% less likely to be poor if they use their reservations and get into salaried jobs, as opposed to starting something of their own or going into non-salaried or non-organized sectors, becoming farmers. Reservations are numerically helping people. India is already lagging in productivity. Are we really going to let some social justice scheme harm our productivity even further? Don't you want India to succeed at a global stage? This productivity argument is as old as time and it is globally contested. So, a team of researchers quantitatively assessed this in the world's largest affirmative action program, which is the Indian Railways. And what they did was they tried to judge how much productivity fell, first in the entirety of railways and then in just white collar strategic managerial roles. When controlled for all other factors, what was found was that there was absolutely no decrease in productivity. In fact, there might have been a slight increase in productivity that they recorded because of a variety of reasons, but since the study does not conclusively assert that productivity increases, we won't go with that. Productivity does not decrease though. India is an apartheid state against the upper castes. The Dalit dad was always home for dinner. Whereas my dad, he was out working hard every night. My mom told me that he was a very hard worker, that he never bowed down to the system, and I believe her. My mom told me that he loved her so much before the system traumatized him and turned him into the man he was. My mom told me that he did not even beat her for the first year of their relationship, but then the system got to him. I was 8 when I heard dad scold mom. I heard mom fall down and all of the utensils too, and there was so much noise, there was so much blood, but dad took care of everything. He took her to the nicest hospital, and when she died, he took her to Banaras, did all of the proper rituals for her. That's just dad, he takes care of all the rituals in our house. When the media kept hounding him, calling him a murderer, I knew what he was going through. I knew why he had gone abroad. I know why he has to stay abroad. It's just the system. I dream of the day when all of these Ambedkarites will stop hounding my dad, and when my dad will be able to return to this country that he loves so much. Till then, I will be his good son, his obedient son. I know what he's going through, and I'm not going to let some leftists, some Ambedkarites tell me what's what. Maybe if Ambedkar was never born, my mom would still be here. Remember my friend, the school topper? He outperformed everyone in class 12 and all eyes were on him, expecting him to join some prestigious engineering college. Instead, he joined the National Law University and is currently pursuing a law degree. Nobody knew if he had made use of his OBC reservations, but everyone had a lot to say about it. How this genius who was outperforming the entire school had somehow stolen the opportunity from some candidate who deserved it more. What I believed, what all of us believed, was that reservations were supposed to help poor people become not poor. It just so happened that when the constitution was being made, all of these poor people belonged to the same few castes. There was no public intellectual telling us that reservations are about representation, and we weren't going to read thick books on Dalit studies. No 15-year-old will read through all of that boring material when he has movies to watch and women to be afraid of. What the philosophers of a society do or say or write finds its way into popular culture. Look at queer theory in the West. Homosexuality was written about exclusively by straight white men, and thus nothing was known about it until queer academics decided to represent themselves and write their own truth. Imagine if Ambedkar had become a Google engineer, or had he become an officer following his father's footsteps. He would never have had that sort of an impact on society. What I'm getting at is that to battle casteism, we need better public intellectuals. Public intellectuals who can explain casteism to the upper castes, for whom caste is just another political discourse. Public intellectuals who can explain casteism to lower castes and show them the strength in their numbers. Okay, but that's just one way to go about it. What can I, somebody who just smeared fake poop on his face for a YouTube video, and you, somebody who just saw someone smear fake poop on his face for a YouTube video, what can we do? In my opinion, the greatest impact that we can have is by being the generation that finally puts an end to endogamy, which is the practice of marrying exclusively within your caste. The caste system only perpetuates from one generation to another because powerful people within communities, daddies, these powerful people hold an irrational amount of sway over the love lives of the next generation. You might have heard of Shadi.com. They are constantly running ads on TV. They're one of the most promising tech companies from India. Shadi.com is owned by People Interactive Private Limited. And People Interactive Private Limited has a few other clones of Shadi.com. Marathi matrimony, Kannada matrimony, SC matrimony, Yadav Sangam, Kayasth matrimony, Brahmin Shadi, Rajput Shadi, Yadav Shadi, Agarwal Shadi, Arora Shadi, Marwadi Shadi, Nayar Shadi, Nadar Shadi, Kashyap Shadi, Patel Shadi, Sunni Shadi, Khatri Shadi. 100 applications. Well done, guys. We have put caste system on the Play Store. I think the blockchain should be next. Dalit coin. To the moon, but only when the Brahmins allow. And this isn't just me. In his phenomenal Annihilation of Caste, Ambedkar writes,
I am convinced that the real remedy is intermarriage. Fusion of blood can alone create the feeling of being kith and kin. And unless this feeling of kinship, of being kindred, becomes paramount, the separatist feeling, the feeling of being aliens, created by caste, will not vanish. Where society is cut asunder, marriage as a binding force becomes a matter of urgent necessity. The real remedy for breaking caste is intermarriage. Nothing else will serve as the solvent of caste.
I'd like to believe that this giant systemic issue could just be solved by loving someone, but it probably won't happen. You won't go and marry some person from a scheduled tribe who is not fair, who doesn't speak English, who won't appreciate the same movies as you, and you won't be wrong for it. You can't force exogamy just like you shouldn't force endogamy. Realistically, it will start scratching the surface of it. And maybe over several generations, it would have a considerable impact. In any case, that is one of the most high impact things that we can do as common people with no power or authority.
So go commit caste jihad, comrades. You have nothing to lose but your chains.
The title of this video doesn't just include daddy issues to make fun of the casteist news anchor. It's this social need to satisfy the wishes of our elders that just perpetuates our caste system in the first place. Do not let the disappointment of your elders, of your daddies, bully you into disappointing the entire nation for several generations. So, what did we learn today? The caste system still exists. Caste is still extremely relevant in cities. Reservations are still extremely important, although they are imperfect. And anytime you allow endogamy to occur, you are locking up the economic and social possibilities of this entire nation. Was this entire video just a very long way to convince some Savarn hottie to date me? Yes, it was.